He invited his ex to his wedding. She showed up with 2 little girls who looked exactly like him. Maya had stared at the envelope for nearly an hour before she found the courage to open it, her fingers tracing the embossed gold edges as if the texture might prepare her for what was inside. She had no idea who would send her something so extravagant. Her life now was quiet, small, far removed from the glittering circles she once brushed against. When she slid the thick card free, the words on it made her stomach clench so hard she thought she might drop it. "You're invited to my wedding." No name, no details beyond the time and place, but she didn't need them. She knew his handwriting instantly. Ethan Hale. The man who had walked out of her life without a word, without giving her a chance to defend herself against accusations she hadn't understood until it was too late. The man whose face she saw in the mirror every time her daughters smiled. She should have thrown it away. She should have torn it into shreds and let it fall like confetti into the waste bin. Instead she sat down at the edge of the bed, the sunlight pooling on the floor and catching the soft curls of Ava and Grace as they played together on the rug. At 4 years old, they were still in that magical stage of complete innocence, unbothered by the complexities of adult choices, their world small enough to be contained in the warmth of their mother's arms. The girls looked so much like Ethan that it was sometimes painful to meet their eyes. The same pale blonde hair that glinted gold in the sun, the same clear blue irises framed by lashes too long to seem real. There was no mistaking their heritage, and yet Ethan had never seen them. The more she thought about it, the more the question gnawed at her. Why invite her now? What possible reason could he have for reaching into a life he had made no effort to be part of? Was it arrogance? Pity? A cruel game to parade his happiness before the woman he had abandoned? She couldn't be sure, but she did know one thing: ignoring it would mean letting him keep the last word. For years she had carried the unanswered weight of their ending, always pushing it down, telling herself she didn't need closure. Yet holding that invitation now, she realized she wanted it more than she had ever admitted. She imagined walking into his world again after all this time, the walls of opulence he lived behind, the people who would glance at her and her daughters with thin, polite smiles. It would hurt. It might even break her a little. But she would go. Not for him, and not to prove anything to anyone, but for herself, to see his face when he realized what he had missed. She folded the invitation back into its envelope, set it on the table, and told the girls they would be taking a trip. Ava clapped at the mention of going somewhere special, while Grace simply asked if there would be cake. Maya laughed despite herself, her heart twisting as she smoothed their hair. Whatever happened, she thought, they would walk in together. And whatever truth came of it, she would not look away. The coastal mansion stood like something out of a magazine, its sweeping terraces lined with white roses and glass railings that reflected the early afternoon sun. Maya felt the girls' small hands tighten in hers as they stepped through the arched entrance, the murmur of music and voices spilling toward them like a tide. She had chosen the girls' dresses with care, simple white cotton with soft skirts that moved when they walked, their blonde hair brushed smooth and tied back with little satin ribbons. They looked like they belonged here, though the truth was they had never known a life like this, and neither had she for a very long time. The air smelled of salt from the nearby ocean, mingling with the delicate sweetness of the flowers, but beneath it all was something sharper, a tension she could feel as soon as the first guests turned to look at them. They crossed the terrace slowly, Maya holding her head high despite the eyes following them. Some people smiled politely, some whispered behind their champagne flutes. She recognized no one except for the man who had written those 5 words in gold script. Ethan Hale stood near the center of the space, dressed in a tailored navy suit that made his blonde hair seem even paler, his blue eyes sharp and unreadable. Beside him, Sloane Reed was everything a society bride was expected to be, slender, luminous, with a designer gown that trailed like a cloud. Ethan was speaking to someone when he glanced in their direction, but the moment his gaze landed on them, the words seemed to die on his lips. It was the kind of reaction Maya had both dreaded and hoped for. He froze, his expression shifting almost imperceptibly from surprise to something deeper, something unsettled. His eyes flicked from her to the girls and back again, lingering long enough on their faces that she knew he saw it, the unmistakable reflection of himself in them. For a moment the sound of music and conversation faded, replaced by a stillness that felt almost dangerous. Then Sloane turned her head, following his gaze, and Maya saw the way her smile faltered, just for a second. Maya kept walking, letting the girls lead her toward an open space near the edge of the terrace where they could see the ocean. She had no intention of approaching him first, no intention of giving him the satisfaction of thinking she was here to plead or explain. The girls, oblivious to the weight of the moment, pointed out a sailboat in the distance, giggling as the breeze lifted the ribbons in their hair. Behind her, she could feel Ethan's presence like a shadow, the unspoken question hanging between them so thick it almost had a shape. When she finally glanced over her shoulder, she found his eyes still locked on hers, but he made no move toward her. Instead, a series of guests closed the space between them, congratulating him, shaking his hand, keeping him in place as if the flow of the event itself had conspired to hold him back. Maya turned away again, focusing on her daughters. They deserved her attention more than he did. Still, in the quiet corner of her mind, she wondered how long he could pretend not to cross the distance between them. And when he did, she promised herself she would be ready, not to beg, not to justify, but to face him with the truth he had refused to see for 4 long years. It was Ethan who finally broke the stalemate. The music swelled as another round of drinks was passed, but his focus was fixed entirely on the corner of the terrace where Maya stood with the girls. He excused himself from the conversation with a polite nod, though his steps lacked the easy confidence he was known for in boardrooms and press conferences. Each stride toward her seemed to chip away at the composure he had worn so effortlessly for years. Maya saw him coming long before he reached them, her body instinctively straightening, every muscle braced against the impact of seeing him this close again. The girls had no sense of the moment's gravity, and when they noticed a tall man approaching, they simply watched him with the same open curiosity they showed to strangers in the park. He stopped just a few feet away, his gaze dropping briefly to Ava and Grace before returning to Maya. For a heartbeat, neither of them spoke. The air between them was thick with everything that had been left unsaid, years of absence pressed into a single silent exchange. Maya forced herself to meet his eyes, refusing to let him see how much her heart was pounding. When she finally spoke, her voice was even, almost casual. "This is Ava. And this is Grace." The girls, hearing their names, smiled faintly but stayed close to her side. "Therefore," she added, the words carrying a quiet weight that needed no explanation. Ethan's jaw tightened, and it took him a moment to respond. "You came," he said finally, as though he still couldn't quite believe she was here in front of him. Maya tilted her head slightly. "I was invited," she replied, and from the small clutch she carried, she pulled out the envelope, holding it so the light caught the gold crest stamped on the flap. His eyes dropped to it, and she saw recognition flicker across his face. It was his own personal monogram, something only he or someone close to him could have authorized for use. He looked past her for an instant, scanning the crowd until his gaze landed on Sloane, who was laughing for a photographer's camera as if she hadn't just seen her groom speaking to a woman from his past. Before Ethan could say more, a perfectly manicured hand touched Maya's arm lightly. Sloane had crossed the terrace with the poise of someone who owned every room she entered. "And you are?" she asked, her tone dripping with false politeness, though the steel beneath it was unmistakable. Maya smiled faintly. "Someone your fiancé invited," she said, passing her the envelope without breaking eye contact. Sloane took it, glanced at the crest, and then handed it back without a word, her expression smoothing into a mask. "Well," she said, her voice so sweet it was almost bitter, "enjoy the view. That's what everyone comes here for." Without waiting for a reply, she turned and walked away, her gown whispering against the stone floor. The girls shifted beside Maya, sensing the tension without understanding it. Ethan's gaze lingered on them again, his features softening for just a fraction of a second before hardening once more. "We need to talk," he said, his voice low enough that only she could hear. Maya looked at him steadily. "We do. But not here. Not like this." He seemed ready to argue, but the master of ceremonies called him back toward the center of the terrace for photographs, and he hesitated just long enough for the moment to slip away. As he turned to go, Maya felt the smallest surge of triumph, because for the first time, it wasn't her chasing him. It was him who would have to decide how far he was willing to come. The celebration moved from the open terrace into the mansion's grand banquet hall, a space designed to impress with its soaring ceilings, glittering chandeliers, and walls lined with centuries-old oil paintings. The long tables were draped in ivory linen, each place setting marked with gold-edged china and crystal that caught the light in delicate rainbows. A string quartet played from the corner, their music weaving around the low hum of conversation, the clink of glasses, and the soft shuffle of servers moving between the guests. Maya followed the current of people into the room, Ava and Grace still clutching her hands, their small eyes darting from one glittering detail to the next. The girls were too young to understand the politics of such an event, but they could feel the energy in the room, the subtle way heads turned toward them, the way whispers spread faster than the wine being poured. Maya guided the girls toward a quieter corner near a cluster of tall windows that looked out onto the ocean. From here, she could see Ethan moving through the crowd with that familiar poise, greeting guests, smiling at cameras, but his eyes kept flicking toward her when he thought she wasn't looking. She noticed the way he seemed distracted, missing cues in conversations, nodding at people without really hearing them. It was strange to see him like this, unmoored, his perfect composure cracked by something he clearly hadn't prepared for. As she stood by the window, a man with silver hair and an impeccably tailored suit approached. His presence carried authority, not just in the way he moved but in the way the crowd seemed to instinctively make space for him. "Miss Carter," he said, his voice measured but cool. "Thomas Hale." The name settled in her mind immediately, Ethan's father. She gave him a polite nod, saying nothing at first. He didn't waste time. "I think it would be best for everyone if you left quietly," he continued. "Events like this are delicate. You understand." His gaze slid to the girls, assessing them the way a man might study a line in a financial report. "Children don't belong in situations like these." Maya met his eyes without flinching. "They belong with their mother," she said simply, her tone calm but firm. Thomas's jaw shifted slightly, a flicker of annoyance breaking through his polished demeanor. "Be reasonable," he said, lowering his voice. "You're here for some reason, money, perhaps? Let's handle it privately." Before Maya could answer, another voice cut through the tension. "Dad, step back." Ethan was suddenly there, his expression sharper than she'd seen it all afternoon. He placed himself between her and his father, his tone clipped. "They're staying." Thomas looked at his son for a long moment, something like a silent battle passing between them, before he finally stepped away, muttering something about the press. Ethan turned back to Maya, his voice quieter now but still urgent. "Can you wait with the girls in the conservatory? I'll come find you." She wanted to ask him what he planned to do, but something in his eyes told her he was already holding back more than he was saying. Without another word, she led Ava and Grace through a side door, past a hallway lined with portraits, until they reached the glass-walled conservatory. The space was warm and humid, filled with the scent of citrus from the lemon trees growing in large terracotta pots. Sunlight filtered through the glass ceiling, dappling the tiled floor where koi fish swam lazily in a small pond. The girls wandered toward it, their laughter echoing softly, but Maya remained by the door, her mind racing. She could feel the weight of what had just happened, not just Ethan's unexpected defense of her, but the way his father's words confirmed something she had always suspected: her presence here was more than just an unwelcome surprise. There was a story beneath this, and she intended to find out what it was. Somewhere in the other wing of the mansion, Ethan was moving quickly, and she wondered if he was finally chasing the truth he had once chosen to ignore. The conservatory felt like a world apart from the rest of the wedding, its air heavy with the smell of damp soil and the sweetness of blooming jasmine. The girls sat cross-legged on the warm tile near the koi pond, their small fingers dipping into the water as they tried to entice the fish to come closer. Maya leaned against one of the stone pillars, her hands folded loosely in front of her, the weight of the afternoon pressing down on her shoulders. Every sound from the distant banquet hall, applause, bursts of laughter, the faint strains of music, felt like a reminder that she stood on the edge of a stage she had no intention of stepping onto. Still, she knew Ethan would come. He had too many questions in his eyes earlier to simply let her leave without answers. When the door finally swung open, the sharp click of polished shoes against the tile broke the quiet. Ethan stood there, framed by the light from the hallway, his suit jacket unbuttoned, the tie at his collar pulled slightly loose. He looked like a man who had just walked out of a battle, though his voice was steady when he said her name. She didn't move toward him. "Why did you disappear?" she asked before he could speak, her tone cutting through the heavy air between them. His gaze dropped to the floor for a moment before returning to hers, and she saw something there that she hadn't seen before, hesitation, almost shame. "I was told." He stopped, his jaw working as though he was forcing the words out. "I was told they weren't mine. There were photos. A letter. A test result. I thought it was real." The explanation hit her like cold water, not because it surprised her, but because it confirmed the suspicions she had carried for years. "And you just believed it," she said, not raising her voice, but making no effort to hide the bitterness. "You didn't even ask me." Ethan's shoulders tensed. It was the night before an investor meeting that could decide the company's future. "I convinced myself it was easier to accept it than to question it. I told myself I was protecting what I'd built. I was wrong." Before Maya could reply, Ava's small voice broke the tension. "Are you our dad?" she asked, her big blue eyes fixed on him with a curiosity so pure it made the air between them crackle. Ethan looked at her as if the floor had shifted under his feet, his carefully constructed world tilting just enough for the truth to break through. "If you'll let me," he said finally, his voice rougher now, "I want to be." Grace tilted her head, still studying him, then returned her attention to the fish as if she had already decided to wait and see. Maya took a slow breath, her mind spinning with everything he had said and left unsaid. She wasn't ready to forgive him, not yet, but there was something in his face she hadn't expected, not just regret, but a hunger to make things right. "We'll do a DNA test," she said, her tone deliberate, "and when it's done, we'll see where we stand." Ethan nodded without hesitation. "Tomorrow," he promised. The girls glanced between them, not fully grasping the meaning, but sensing that something important had just been set in motion. Outside the conservatory windows, the ocean shimmered in the distance, and for the first time in years, Maya allowed herself to think that maybe, just maybe, the truth was finally on its way to the surface. Morning light spilled through the sheer curtains of the small hotel suite Maya had taken for the night, softening the sharp edges of her thoughts. Ava and Grace were still curled up in the bed beside her, their breathing even, the warmth of their bodies pressed against her. She lay still for a long moment, listening to the faint hum of the city outside, knowing that the day ahead would demand more from her than she wanted to give. Agreeing to the DNA test had been the right choice. She wanted the truth on record, not just for Ethan but for her daughters, but the weight of what that truth might mean settled heavily on her chest. Once the results came back, there would be no going back to the quiet anonymity she had built for them. By late morning, she was guiding the girls into a sleek black car that had been sent for them. The driver offered a polite nod and a practiced smile, and the ride to the private clinic passed in relative silence except for Ava's chatter about the koi pond from the day before. When they arrived, Ethan was already waiting in the lobby, dressed simply in dark jeans and a button-down shirt, his hair slightly tousled as if he'd run his hands through it too many times. He greeted the girls with a tentative smile, crouching down to their height without touching them, as if afraid of crossing a boundary he hadn't yet earned the right to cross. Maya watched him closely, noting the subtle differences in him, less of the controlled detachment he'd shown at the wedding, more of something raw, unguarded. Inside the clinic, everything smelled faintly of antiseptic and lavender air freshener. The process was quick and clinical. A technician swabbed the inside of each child's cheek, then Ethan's, sealing the samples in labeled envelopes. Maya stood beside her daughters, answering their questions in gentle tones, while Ethan remained a step back, his hands in his pockets, his gaze fixed on the floor as though the act itself was heavier than he had anticipated. When it was over, the technician explained that results would be available within 3 business days. Maya nodded, thanked her, and took the girl's hands again, ready to leave. But Ethan stopped them at the door. "I don't want to wait until then to try," he said quietly, glancing at the girls before meeting Maya's eyes. "I know I have no right to ask, but, could I take you all to lunch? Just to spend some time with them. No pressure, no questions, just time." Maya hesitated, her instinct to protect the girls warring with the curiosity she felt. She wanted to see what he would do when there were no formalities, no audience, no agenda. Finally, she agreed, her tone neutral. "Somewhere casual. They're kids, not executives." They ended up at a small seaside cafe with a weathered deck and a view of the waves breaking against the rocks. The girls devoured grilled cheese sandwiches while Ethan told them stories about the ocean, how whales sang to each other, how crabs could walk sideways, how seagulls were the pirates of the shore. His voice softened when he spoke to them, his eyes lighting in a way that made it almost impossible to reconcile him with the man who had once chosen to walk away. Maya sat across from him, saying little, but she caught the way his gaze kept drifting between the girls and her, as if trying to map out the years he had missed. When lunch was over, Ethan offered to walk them along the beach. The girls ran ahead, chasing the tide, their laughter carried away by the wind. Ethan fell into step beside Maya, his hands deep in his pockets. "Whatever those results say," he murmured, his voice barely audible over the surf, "I want to be here. I don't care how complicated it gets." She didn't answer right away, keeping her eyes on the 2 small figures darting along the water's edge. But inside, she felt the smallest crack in the wall she'd built around herself. The tide was coming in, and she knew there was no stopping it now. 2 days later, Maya found herself pacing the length of her living room, the quiet hum of the refrigerator in the background the only steady sound in an otherwise restless morning. Ava and Grace were in their bedroom, building towers from blocks and narrating elaborate stories to each other, their voices rising and falling in a rhythm only they understood. Outside, the sky hung low and gray, a steady drizzle tapping against the windows. She kept glancing at the clock, not because the results were due at any exact time, but because waiting had become an ache in her chest that wouldn't ease. She told herself she was ready for either outcome. After all, she knew the truth, but there was still a knot of unease, a residue of those years when someone else's lies had been enough to turn Ethan away without a second thought. When the call finally came, it was Ethan's voice on the other end, low and deliberate. "They're mine," he said without preamble, but his words were heavy with something more than just confirmation. "Both of them. There's no question." Maya didn't respond right away. She let the words sink in, let them settle into the space that had been carved out by absence and suspicion for so long. "I know," she said at last, and her tone carried no triumph, just a quiet certainty. There was a long pause before he asked, "Can I come over?" She hesitated, looking toward the girls' room, hearing their laughter carry down the hall, then said yes. He arrived less than half an hour later, rain still clinging to his coat, the wind having left his hair slightly tousled. When Ava opened the door, she looked up at him without shyness, only curiosity. Grace appeared beside her, clutching a stuffed rabbit, her wide brown eyes studying him as though trying to decide what to make of him. Ethan knelt down, his voice catching slightly as he said their names, and for the first time, he let himself close the space entirely, pulling them both into a gentle hug. Maya stood back, watching the scene unfold with a mixture of relief and apprehension. The sight of him holding them, his daughters, was both healing and dangerous, a reminder of what had been taken from them and what might still be rebuilt. They spent the afternoon together, the four of them. Ethan helped the girls make a mess in the kitchen as they decorated cookies, the counters dusted with powdered sugar, sprinkles scattered across the floor. He laughed more easily than she remembered, unguarded and warm, and the girls responded in kind, pulling him into their games as if they had been waiting for him without even knowing it. Every so often, Maya would catch him looking at her, not with the arrogance or distance of the man she had once known, but with something steadier, something that felt almost like gratitude. As the day faded and the rain eased, he helped tuck the girls into bed, listening as Ava demanded one more story and Grace insisted on holding his hand until she fell asleep. When he finally stepped back into the living room, Maya was waiting by the window, her arms folded loosely. "They're happy," he said quietly, almost to himself. "You did that." She met his eyes, her voice level. "We did that. You just weren't here." He didn't flinch, but he didn't look away either. "I'm here now," he said, and though it wasn't a promise, it felt dangerously close to one. She knew that tomorrow, and the days after, would test those words. But for the first time in years, the possibility of believing them didn't feel impossible. Spring arrived slowly that year, the last of winter's chill lingering in the air even as new buds began to appear along the edges of the park where Maya often took Ava and Grace in the afternoons. It had been 3 weeks since the DNA results, 3 weeks of Ethan showing up with a steadiness that surprised her. He didn't just visit, he rearranged his calendar, postponed meetings, and on more than one occasion walked away from a business dinner to make it in time to read the girls a bedtime story. At first, Maya watched these gestures with suspicion, wondering when the novelty would wear off, when the man who once turned away without a fight would retreat again. But the retreat never came. Instead, he began to weave himself into their routines, not as an intruder, but as someone quietly learning where he fit. One Saturday, he took them all to the zoo. Maya hadn't planned to go, but Ava and Grace had both insisted she come, their small hands tugging at hers until she gave in. Ethan didn't make it about grand gestures, there were no photographers, no security detail trailing behind. He bought paper maps at the entrance and let the girls lead, their giggles carrying through the air as they dragged him from one exhibit to the next. She noticed the way he crouched down to their level to explain why flamingos were pink, the way he lifted them both effortlessly so they could see the giraffes reaching for leaves high in the trees, the way he let Grace smear ice cream across his shirt without flinching. It was the kind of day that threaded itself into memory quietly, without fanfare, and it unsettled her in the best way. That night, after they returned home and the girls were asleep, Ethan stayed behind while Maya made tea. The apartment was quiet except for the low hum of the kettle. She placed 2 mugs on the table, her movements slow, deliberate. "You've changed," she said finally, breaking the comfortable silence. Ethan looked at her for a long moment before answering. "I had to. I spent 4 years convincing myself I'd done the right thing, and it took one afternoon to realize I'd been a coward. I don't want to be that man anymore." His words were simple, but they carried the weight of something lived, not rehearsed. She studied him, remembering the Ethan she had known before, the one who had seemed untouchable, who carried himself like the world bent to his will, who believed he could choose when and where to give his heart. That man was still there, in pieces, but there was something new layered over him now, a humility she hadn't expected to see. "It's not just about being here," she said quietly. "It's about staying, even when it's hard. Especially when it's hard." He didn't argue, didn't promise. He just nodded once, as if accepting the unspoken challenge. Weeks turned into months. The boundaries between them shifted slowly, almost imperceptibly, until dinners together became the norm, until the girls began to run to him without hesitation, until Maya realized she no longer waited for him to disappear. There was no single moment when forgiveness arrived. It seeped in like the changing seasons, so gradual she barely noticed it until it was already there. One warm evening in late summer, the 4 of them sat on a blanket by the water, watching the sun dip into the horizon. Ava leaned against Ethan's side, half asleep, while Grace traced patterns in the sand. Maya sat across from them, her knees drawn up, and when Ethan met her gaze, there was no tension, no guardedness, only the quiet recognition of what they had rebuilt. It wasn't perfect. It never would be. But it was theirs, born from truth and tempered by the choice to stay. As the last light faded and the first stars appeared, Ethan reached for her hand, not with the urgency of someone trying to hold on, but with the steadiness of someone who knew he wasn't letting go. And for the first time since the day he'd walked away, Maya didn't feel the need to pull back. I think the ending of this story works because it doesn't try to paint over the pain with something unrealistically perfect, but instead shows that healing and trust can be rebuilt slowly, piece by piece, when both sides are willing to fight for it. Ethan's transformation from a man who walked away without a word to someone who consistently showed up for Maya and the girls feels earned, not given for free. It's not just a romantic resolution, it's also about accountability, patience, and proving with actions rather than promises. Maya's decision to open the door to him again isn't portrayed as naive forgiveness, but as a cautious, deliberate choice rooted in seeing real change. The final scene, with them sitting together by the water as a family, is powerful because it's quiet. It's not a grand proposal or a dramatic speech, but a simple, steady connection that feels stronger for having survived so much. The happy ending doesn't erase the hurt of the past, but it shows that love, when paired with truth and consistency, can grow back even in the places where it was once cut down.